Thank you for joining me of this experiment here. Doing a brief video overview of Apple's iPad Air 2, originally released in October of 2014, the latest in the flagship 9.7-inch iPad line. And compared to last year's model, we moved from the A7, Apple's first generation 64-bit SoC that was shared with the iPhone 5S and the iPad Mini 2, up to a special A8X that is only used in the iPad Air 2. We also get a doubling of RAM up to 2 gigabytes, and as you can see down here, Apple's Touch ID sensor is added to the iPad with this go-around as well. On the subject of that Touch ID sensor, as you can see, it works pretty much perfectly. All you have to do is just hit your finger to it and it unlocks. Compared to the fingerprint swipe-based sensor in my Galaxy S5, which works maybe half the time on a good day, it's definitely glad to see Samsung has adopted this kind of sensor in the Galaxy S6. Performance-wise, the iPad continues its performance leadership. Last generation posted some impressive benchmark numbers as a result of the Cyclone core at the heart of the A7, and this generation, the A8X in the iPad Air 2 actually does something that's a first for an iOS device. It adds a third processor core, and as I mentioned, another first for an iOS device, it has 2 gigabytes of RAM. The end result is that the multitasking experience on the iPad Air 2 is about the best you're going to see in a mobile device, short of maybe some of the Samsung tablets that have 3 gigs. We've got the usual perfectly smooth scrolling in iOS, but it's really highlighted here that you can open a lot of different tabs and not run into full tab reloads. On my Nexus 7 that this replaced, I would get full tab reloads after hitting about the 4th tab. As you can see, that's not going to be the case here. We still got all 4 tabs in memory, but we can actually load up quite a few more. You can also see page load performance is spectacular. 7 tabs open now, and we can still go back to any of them, and we're not going to be seeing any full tab reloads. You might get that flash of a white screen on one as it's defrosted or rehydrated, but yeah, we're switching here between 7 tabs, some of which are pretty large sites, and we're not getting any sort of tab reloading. Brief overview of iOS and some of the things it does right. You might notice the multitasking interface has adopted this card-based thing that was added in iOS 7 that's pretty clear riff on the WebOS card multitasking UI, but it's hard to complain too much about that because the WebOS card-based UI was the best multitasking I've seen on a tablet. In addition, there are some multitasking gestures that you might be aware of if you've used an iPad in the past. 4-finger swipe to switch between applications. 4-finger up to re-invoke the multitasking UI. You just had a problem with it there. That's not the first time. There's something about that gesture doesn't always seem to trigger perfectly. The one gesture that does always trigger perfectly that I have no problems with is back to the home screen, and that is really handy. So, as you're aware, the app selection on the iPad is probably the best you're going to find in terms of tablet-optimized applications. Twitter, for example, has an iPad-specific app, though the improvements versus the Android experience are pretty minimal, actually, despite how often this gets brought up as the marquee example of a difference between the two tablet platforms. You get this little pop-up instead of it filling the whole screen, and you get the things along the side instead of across the top, but really it's not that different. Some applications, on the other hand, are much better optimized specifically for the tablet. One of the best and simultaneously worst when you think about it examples is Google's Hangouts, which on the iPad has a multi-pane layout here. Whereas even on Android tablets, it's just a blown-up version of the phone app. However, in those situations where you run into an application that hasn't been optimized for tablets on either platform, the end result on iOS is a lot less pretty than the end result on Android. You get your choice of blown up to double size and clearly using non-retina assets and not scaling the fonts properly, or teeny tiny, clearly still in the old 3:2 aspect ratio of the iPhone 4 and 4S, right in the middle of the screen. So the last thing I want to address, and carrying on from applications, NAND performance is very good on this particular model, and indeed probably on all the models. That being said, you should not buy the 16GB model, and here is why. There's no space available on it. The entire device has less than 11 gigabytes of space available to the user after iOS takes up its chunk, and it's eaten up so quickly. As you can see, Hearthstone is almost a gigabyte, GarageBand and iMovie are both over 700 megabytes, Word is over 500, PowerPoint, Excel, Pages, OneNote, they're all several hundred megabytes. So that slightly less than 11 gigs of space that you have available gets eaten up so quickly. Don't make this mistake, is basically all I can say. You can live in 16 if you're the kind of person that doesn't play any games, doesn't use any apps really other than the web browser at all. Then you probably should buy a cheaper tablet. But if you're going to buy the iPad anyways, then you could live in the 16 gigabyte model. But the extremely powerful GPU and CPU and for an iOS device, massive 2 gigabytes of RAM are really good for lots of multitasking with lots of applications and playing high performance games like Hearthstone, like Modern Combat 5 if you can tolerate a shooter on a touchscreen, like The Room or whatever, that look good, but games that look good tend to be big. And you're going to run out of space very quickly if you don't get at least the 64 gigabyte model. So while I am always hesitant to recommend paying the highway robbery prices OEMs charge to upgrade NAND, this is an unfortunate situation where you probably should do just that. So that's just a seat-of-the-pants video overview of the iPad Air 2. Generally speaking, everything about it is definitely a significant improvement from the previous generations of the device. The move to 2 gigs of RAM, and the A8X is incredibly powerful GPU and CPU. It's very lightweight, it's extremely thin, and performance is just spectacular. Just make sure you get one with enough storage for your use case. I'll hit on more details in the full review down below this video, but the long and short version is, do I recommend buying this if you're in the market for a 10-inch tablet? The answer is an unabashed yes. It's probably the best one you can get. Just make sure you get a big enough one. So anyways, thanks for putting up with my rambling. Hopefully, once we get this edited down and condensed, it won't bore you to death too much. And feel free to read on to the rest of the review if bored to death is what you're looking for.